Welcome to Educators Podcast. Hi, my name is Swapnil. I work as an intensive care specialist in Sydney. And today I'm very honored and privileged to have Professor Mark Stevens in this episode of Educators Podcast. Just a brief introduction about Mark. He's a professor and course director at Department of Family Medicine at Penn State. And I met Mark for the first time at Health Professional Museum Educator Fellowship course at Harvard Massey. He's an amazing individual with a very special interest in mask making. So first of all, welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Swapnil. It's so nice for you to have invited me. I'm really glad to be here.
Thanks for spending your valuable time because we're in the midst of COVID-19 and a lot of things are going in states at the moment. So I just want to start by asking, what's your experience through COVID-19 as a medical educator? What are the kind of challenges that you faced and how did you address those problems?
Yeah, thanks. I feel like our situation here is similar to folks all over the world. And so where I currently am, Penn State's an interesting situation. Our main medical campus is about 100 miles away to our southeast. We're a regional campus here in rural central Pennsylvania. So from a geographic standpoint, it actually coincided with spring break. The main undergraduate institution with over 40,000 students is here in central Pennsylvania. They went on spring break, and that's when the COVID really sort of caught wind, if I could say it that way. And wisely, our senior administrators told the students not to come back for spring break. And I share that because I feel that was an important public health move that spared potentially the community here much of what other places like New York City or Seattle have endured. So for us, when the AAMC instructed students would not be in clinical activity, I think just like everybody, we pivoted pretty hard. Our students call it, quote, Zoom school now. And so we've been attending Zoom school. And the way we have our education here, Swapnil, is the first year students are embedded from day one in clinical activity. And so they bring patient narratives to class, and we use those narratives to construct our learning objectives. So we had to pivot to using paper cases or problem-based learning cases from organic or in vivo cases. And that was a real mindset shift for the students, and I think all of us understand that there's no substitute for the real thing. I mean, just that organic human connection is fundamental to everything that we do in the heart of the doctor-patient relationship. And so that was, for me, probably the biggest challenge, was trying as hard as possible to simulate case-based activities, realizing that it was at best a substitute. But I wouldn't be fair in not really honoring the students, because if the students don't dig in and participate, everything falls apart, and ours surely did. So we've worked pretty hard to move the educational arena as well as the clinical arena to telehealth and video conferencing. And Swapnil, I am so curious to see, I told the students they had their final exam this last Friday, so we just finished the first year. And I made them a gentle person's bet that they will remember more information from the last 3 months than any other segment of their first year of medical school. I think that this unprecedented time will create memory channels that will be deep and meaningful. So I choose to look at what I call the silver linings of COVID.
Thanks, Mark. It's very fascinating to see how different educators dealt with COVID-19 in a very different ways. And I like your optimistic attitude to see that there is still a silver lining to entire COVID-19. And I guess a lot of educators adapted in a very short period of time. And even this idea of Zoom schooling, probably 5 years ago, somebody would have laughed at that idea and said, that's just ridiculous, I guess. But now we are moving forward, and probably some of the changes that we adopted this time might be permanent in the future, I guess. So it's quite interesting to see your perspective on this whole education. So thanks for sharing your insights.
You're welcome.
As I understand, Mark, your niche as a medical educator is mask making and professional identity formation. Both are kind of quite unique, and we are quite keen to understand both things through you. First of all, what is professional identity formation means and how do you study that?
So it was a term for me, Swapnil, that I really didn't encounter until probably 10 years ago. So, perhaps you and I, as we proceeded through our medical education, I feel that I just sort of just did it. And there, I had mentors, people who I looked up to, and I knew I wanted to emulate behaviors. And then there were others whose behaviors I knew I didn't want to emulate. And I knew a little bit about the hidden curriculum. I don't know that it had been named in that way. But I can't say that I had an intentional and thoughtful process of learning to think, act, and feel like a physician. And so as I think about professional identity formation in terms of a definition, going through a lot of literature and talking to a lot of people about this, I distill it down to those sort of three elements: learning to think, act, and feel like a physician. And those are distinct domains. And when I think about myself as I entered medical school, nobody in my family had ever been in medicine. And so that was a new journey for me. And I brought a lot of personal identities, social identities, spiritual identities, intellectual identities to the table. Then was sort of went through an experience of, do I really belong here? This imposter phenomenon that I think is super common, that I'd almost like to normalize for the listeners. And working hard in my own life through the years without naming it or knowing it to A, overcome that imposter syndrome, and B, be very authentic and comfortable in my own way of who I am as I think, act, and feel like a physician. And so now I'm just so pleased that at least we can open up conversations about this. And it's very distinct from professionalism, which I would call behavior. This is really more dealing with self. And many will tell you that that's the mystery of life, is figuring out who are you, sort of that constant and ever evolving identification of self. And so that's what I would open with. I think that's a fair definition: learning to think, act, and feel like a physician.
I think that's a very nice, simplistic way of looking, but I'm pretty sure this concept is quite complex. And what's your kind of experience of this identity formation, how it evolves as we go through that graduate schooling process? Because you're right, because when we did our med school, we didn't even know about this concept to start with. How people change their process of thinking, acting, or feeling as they go through year 1 to year 5 or year 6?
Well, I'd like to start to unpack that with a story, if I could. And I'm going to take you back to, this is about the year 2014, 2015, somewhere in there. Before joining the faculty here at Penn State, I was a career military medical officer with the United States Navy. And my last posting was at the Uniformed Services University in Bethesda, Maryland, where we have a medical school for the Army, Navy, Air Force, also public health. And I remember there's a large military hospital in the Washington, D.C. area called Walter Reed. And so this is in the, sort of the war in terms of major casualties was winding down a little bit at that time. But we were dealing with a lot of polytrauma patients. And these are mostly men in 18 to 24-year-old age range, often multiple amputee, as well as traumatic brain injury and PTSD. And one day, as I was walking through one of the ancillary buildings of the hospital, there's an art studio there. And hanging outside the art studio were these haunting masks. And if the listeners are interested, National Geographic, if you just Google National Geographic Wounded Warrior masks, you'll be able to see samples of these masks. And I remember just pausing outside the studio, the art studio there, and looking at these probably for 30 minutes to 45 minutes, just the detail of them. And actually, Melissa Walker is her name. Melissa's an art therapist and a colleague and dear friend. Melissa came outside the studio because I was just sort of hovering there, and she says, "Do you have any questions?" And that actually launched into now going on a 7-year collaboration of what does this all mean. And so I asked her about her work, and she shared that many of these young individuals, they lost their identity. So when they were wounded, a huge part of them was forever taken away in some way, shape, or form. And historically, we often ask people to write about that and what she had learned, or talk about that. And what she had learned was this cohort of particularly young men was not particularly interested in either writing or talking. But she found a key and a lock that the mask making process really over time and with guided support allowed them to explore elements of self and those elements that are lost, or those elements that we long for. And so as I walked back over to my office, I encountered a few students who were third years, and we had a conversation. And I remember thinking, Swapnil, that, wow, what has happened to these individuals? They entered school, I'll say idealistic or empathic, and now it's just there's this veneer or this jadedness about them that just makes me sad. So Melissa and I then started this journey of understanding that this really isn't about burnout. It's about identity and elements of identity that students sacrifice when they come into medical education. And so our work has now evolved into less an exploration of burnout and more an exploration of an iterative journey of identity as individuals proceed through undergraduate, graduate, and then staff medical education.
Great. I guess it's quite fascinating to see that you connected two dots from the wounded soldiers losing their identity to a third-year medical student who have probably changed their identity compared to when they entered the med school. Now, that's a kind of nice segue into the next question, which was connecting the dots between the mask making and professional identity formation. And can you just walk us through your insights so far through your many years of research about how this mask making helps to walk through that journey of professional identity formation for your students?
Thank you, Swapnil. And there's two things that I'd like to emphasize here. So I'm going to start with the mask itself. And each mask has an outside and an inside. And that is analogous to what I would call our own identities. There is a part of self that we choose to show the world, and allow me to call that a projected self. And then there's an element of self that we keep deep inside. And let me call that the authentic or true self. And I would like to suggest that the more space there is between what you're projecting to the world and what you're feeling inside, that void is called identity dissonance. And the broader that dissonance is, the more likely the opportunities for conflict and uncertainty for individuals within the learning space. And so I found that to be a very helpful construct. The second thing I'd like to share is what I'm calling the hero's journey. And I think each of us has it. And join me if you would. So think back to when you were first accepted to medical school. And I would ask you to think about what those emotions were. I'll share mine of, holy cow, this is so exciting. This is unbelievable. Did they make a mistake? Are they sure? So I would really say that this was, a period of tremendous, tremendous joy. But then I think as medical school started, like there was this, wow, this is hard. And I'm going to have to give some things up. And that's what I would call sacrifice. And for me, it was music. Giving up my ability to play music is something that I sacrificed. And I would argue in some ways people give up elements of wellness. Perhaps their nutrition suffers, their physical activity suffers, their behavioral health suffers. But there is this sort of sacrifice. And then I think it sort of begins to bottom out in what people in the hero's journey would call the abyss or the land of darkness. This, oh my gosh, what have I done? I've made this sort of this terrible mistake. But then I think what happens is people begin a process of reclamation. You sort of hit a bottom, and then you take an inventory and say, you know what? Here are some things that are important to me in my sense of self, my overall self, not just my professional identity, but my holistic identity that I really want to reclaim. And for me, that was sports. The ability to actively again engage and play in sports that had been a part of my entire life prior to medical school. But then once I've reclaimed things, I've got to shuffle the deck plate a little bit. In other words, I've got to begin to organize so that I can do what I need to do to complete and survive med school, but I also want to preserve this. So that's sort of what I call an organizational phase. And then finally, there's this integration. How am I going to make all of this work? And so there is sort of this hero's journey. So if you think about Luke Skywalker, Harry Potter, Mulan, or any traditional protagonist, I would argue each of us has a journey like that. And I would also argue we have that journey in medical school, but then I think it starts all over again in residency. You're entering a new community of practice, identifying with new individuals, deciding what you're going to show to them, what you're going to keep to yourself. And then the iteration begins in residency. And then I'm going to argue every time you start a new staff job, the process begins anew. So as shared human beings, as we inhabit this earth, I think this is a process that all of us to one degree or another can relate to.
Thanks, Mark. I think I was fortunate enough to participate in one of those exercises with you at Museum of Fine Arts at Boston. And it was kind of first experience for me. And I wish I could have done that in my med school every single year, as you explained to us what you do with your medical students. So just for the listeners, can you just walk us through that process, that how you practice this at Penn State, and what are the kind of experiences from the student point of view?
It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. So we have normalized it within our culture. And so what I would say is that hanging in my office are probably close to 70 masks from our students through the years. And so when you join our community, art and humanities it's just part of who we are and what we do. And if that's uncomfortable, that's okay. It doesn't have to be comfortable, but it isn't going to go away. It is something that we're going to do together during your time here. And so the first week of medical school, the students are provided with a blank paper mache mask with a series of paints and different color paints and brushes and other materials that they can glue or apply to the mask, and just sort of given an instruction of, it's a prompted exercise, so students aren't left completely hanging, but the idea is for them to really explore. What I like for them to do at that very first mask is for them to, on the outside of the mask, paint their vision of self as an ideal physician. What is that vision of an ideal physician? And then on the inside of the mask, who are you? So who are you? Let us know, or share that story of that authentic self. And universally what happens is a blank paper mache mask sits on the desk for about 5 minutes with awkward silence, folks looking around really uncertain to do, most folks asking me what they should put on their mask, to which I reply, I haven't the foggiest idea. And then it's a beautiful thing to watch. One or two people will get up and head to the paint table. Another person will get up and head to the craft table. Somebody will put on some music. Perhaps students will put in headphones. And then this whole, it's just so interesting to watch. I like to do it in groups of 8 to 12, none bigger, because I think the bigger the group, the harder it is to really authentically dive in. But then there's probably a period of intense work over 30 to 45 minutes where students just dig in. And it's so wonderful to watch. And then it sort of comes to a natural conclusion, sort of that creative flow organically dies down. And then we head into a period of group processing, if the students would like to do that. In other words, here is my mask. Here I am. This is what I want to be. This is what I am. If you want to share, please do. If you don't, that's A-OK too. But then what we do, Swapnil, is we'll have it conclude with elements of a professional identity essay. So we ask the students to write a guided narrative that touches upon the mask and what the mask means to them, but also touches upon elements of professional identity with them moving forward. And what I've found is it's very, very instructive for me as an educator. So students who put together what I would call a lightly sophisticated mask, I think that demonstrates a layer of insight, and what I'll call educational maturity that I pay close attention to. Those are students who may just need a little more seasoning. In other words, I find it a level of intellectual maturity that I just need to really be aware of. Students who really dig in and present a sophisticated mask are students that I think early on are going to be leaders. And those are students who I can look to, who aren't going to be afraid of conflict, who aren't going to be afraid of asking hard questions, and are going to do so respectfully and authentically. And so I think it's almost a triage system from an educational construct with that first mask. Then what we do is we actually repeat that 4 more times through med school. We repeat it at the end of the first year, the end of the second, third, and fourth year. And each time I ask them to create a new mask and to write the narrative. But then I ask them, and we'll give them a copy of their old mask. I ask them to look at that and then compare. What's different? What's the same? How have you grown? And so that's sort of where we are in all of this. So what I'll tell you, Swapnil, is I've got a ton of data. And right now I'm sort of digging through what does this all mean?
Yeah, I think a lot of people will be very interested to hear from you at later stage what actually that data means, because it's so fascinating. And I can share my experience, which was exactly this like similar narration that you gave, that first 5 minutes are so uncomfortable and so awkward. You don't know what to do, and you just watch what everybody else is doing, and you're kind of trying to see, oh, should I say something? It's so that kind of awkwardness, and then suddenly you let it go, and then next 20 minutes is like probably you almost forget everything around you and you connect to yourself. And I think that connection was so powerful, I must say, because I never looked into myself that deeply before. And I think even you're surrounded by a number of people who probably don't know much about, but you still kind of almost forget everything and you kind of go deeper and try to find out why you are here and what's the kind of meaning. And I think that identity formation exercise was quite fascinating for me. And the way you're trying to understand or trying to triage your medical students is also quite interesting for me, because often we don't know how to tailor our education to certain people. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? And I think it's quite interesting that you're using the mask making to identify the strengths and weaknesses in the students. What are the kind of perspectives from the student point of view? So that's your perspective from the educator point of view. But what are the kind of reactions or what are the thoughts of your students with this exercise?
Yeah, I think because their student experience is very similar to yours, Swapnil, I think it's not unusual for students to find the exercise unusual for the first time that we do it. And again, trust is everything. Trust is just the foundation of all of this. So the more we can create a psychologically safe and trusting environment here in our educational community, I think the more comfortable students are really being vulnerable, and in so doing expressing authenticity. And so that first week of medical school, everybody's on their best behavior. And so I think, it's sort of it's taken as more of an arts and crafts activity than a professional identity activity. But that beautiful thing that happens during the first year of medical school, where students begin to think, act, and feel like a physician, takes them to a very different place for that second mask. And so it's really in that second mask where I feel you're starting to see students more meaningfully explore that identity of authentic self, projected self, but related to their life as a physician. And so I think it's kind of a normal. And then by the third year, Swapnil, the students are asking for it. Like, hey, when are we going to get to make our mask? And so it's really kind of just a fun phenomenon to see. And so I think as we've worked to create that culture, it's sort of become, what do I want to say? A brand, maybe? I don't know. But it's sort of become what we do, which makes me smile.
Yeah, no, that's a nice way of putting it together. But what are the kind of patterns emerging from, say, first year to third year? How you see from educators' lens that how these masks are changing? Are there any common themes, and how do you interpret them?
So I think so. I'm hoping someday a long-term vision is to really correlate the masks with Keegan's stages of change. So I'm a big fan of Bob Keegan's stages of change model. As you sort of unpack the adolescent, young adult, and adult mind. And I think the masks are a window into that. I think many professional identity models rely on the narrative or the written word to unpack these things, and that's fine, and that must and should continue. What I think the masks do is complement that. And so as this work evolves, I think, again, if we can create that trusting environment, I think you'll be able to see patterns in the masks that you could then have a feedback conversation with students at different stages in their learning and say, hey, look, through the years, we've done hundreds and hundreds of these, and students with masks like this tend to have professionalism issues or tend to have issues with authority or tend to have issues in the cognitive learning environment. And so the key for me is students are so used to being assessed, and that's such a pesky word. And so I feel like if the more we can create, again, that psychologically safe space where students are not feeling judged, then I think that's important. One thing I do say now is students say, I'm not an artist, and I actually don't run away from that. I say, of course you're not. This is not commercial art, but everybody is an artist. So you're not trying to sell this. What you're trying to do is just engage with it and live with it and be with it. So yeah, that's sort of what I would say is embracing the authenticity of the art at each stage, and then modeling that. I think pairing that with Keegan's model is where I'm really excited to try and go.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. And if I can make a mask, that anybody can make a mask because I'm probably the hopeless artist. So again, coming back to that, as you mentioned, the inside of the mask is your authentic self, and then the outside is a projected self. And I'm kind of worried about that, the dissonance that you mentioned about the difference between the two selves. Do you see any in particular pattern where, or how do you identify that there is kind of that dissonance, and how is there any kind of correlation to burnout with that difference between the authentic self and projected self? Is that kind of a reason for burnout?
I hope to get there someday. So I'll share with you that every session that we do, the invitation to address the outside of the mask and the inside of the mask is there. And I think 85% of people leave the inside blank. And so it's very, very interesting. And I've chosen to this point not to push that. So I think I think it's a risk. I think people are taking a risk to engage in the artistic process, and I definitely want to honor that. And so I really think folks, the first time through, focusing on that outside, just like you're saying, Swapna, looking at what others are doing and, oh no, I feel like my art isn't good enough. I mean, that's kind of like the physician mentality. Like, again, back to that imposter thing. And so working over time to break that down, I think will allow more engagement on the inside of the masks. And so right now, I can't tell you that I've identified using the masks themselves what those themes are on outside and inside to purely get into that. We did a very interesting project in our first year medical students in 2017. So it's the class that will graduate next year. And the way we did it, there were 150 of them. And it was impossible. This was just logistics. It was virtually impossible to get paints and not make a mess of things for 150 students. So we wound up using Sharpies. And what they were tasked to do was actually to write words that describe the ideal physician on the outside and themselves on the inside. And so we analyzed that. That paper came out just this year, identifying differences in themes where students saw certain behaviors, i.e. professionalism in the projected self, if you will, but on the inside was much more in terms of an emotional domain. And so what I really want to do is I really want to start to now in COVID, I really want to repeat that process with this same group of students to see how the coronavirus pandemic has impacted them both in their construct of professionalism, because they're not in clinic right now, as well as emotion. And so that's sort of what's on the table right now, is hopefully exploring that question more explicitly in the context of now the surgical masks that everybody seems to be wearing.
Yeah, that's quite interesting because I was about to ask you that because I read on your one of the Twitter feed that you are kind of trying to explore this mask making phenomena in the COVID-19 pandemic and I'm trying to understand how this helps professional identity formation, especially during the pandemic. Because I'm pretty sure even the pandemic lasted few months, I think the impact will be pretty long standing and it will be quite interesting to see. And have you kind of tried any of those exercises? Obviously, it might be difficult, but have you tried any exercises now?
I did. And it was interesting. So as everything was moving to Zoom school, Penn State put out a call for faculty to create humanities electives, 1 month electives, so that students could keep moving positively towards graduation. And Dr. Bernice Hausman is our chair. We actually have a medical humanities department in our medical school. And so Bernice put out a call for faculty to create an elective. And so after some contemplation, diving into the literature a little while, I actually put together a course called Pandemic Identity, Culture, Communication, and Chaos. And we just finished that on last Thursday as well. And it was really interesting because I asked each student to create an identity capstone, and I left it pretty wide open. They know I'm the mask guy. So they, if they wanted to please the teacher, they could definitely create a mask. But a sub capstone, I asked each of them to take a selfie wearing a mask in their lived environment and then a prompted narrative to describe their lived experience. And out of that came one narrative and one mask where the student actually took a surgical mask and put words on the outside of the surgical mask, words on the inside of the surgical mask, and just this incredibly eloquent narrative of a variety of emotions. And so I reached out to that student and said, hey, this is amazing. Would you like to partner on a project to explore this, what you did for your capstone, with your classmates? And the student jumped all in. And so this week, we're going to be putting together our IRB proposal to really go after that with our medical students. And I will share with you another fun study that's at the IRB right now is a similar analysis of the impact of the pandemic on athletes' identity. So our student athletes have been sort of taken away from competition this spring, taken away from teammates, taken away from practice, taken away from, a big part of their identity. And so we're going to use an analogous process to look at the impact of the pandemic on student athlete identity here at Penn State. So lots of interesting stuff that I hope to keep you posted on.
Yeah, I'm very excited now. And you're just expanding the horizons quite rapidly, I must say. And this is really great stuff, Mark. Keep the great work that you're doing. And it will be great to probably get you on another podcast in a few months' time when you have all these exciting results available. So obviously the COVID-19 pandemic was challenging. And I think one of the questions which is I'm asking to myself is, yes, there's something which is professional identity, which we kind of navigate through, but also our social circumstances, our personal circumstances affect who we are and what struggle that we go through. How much is that impact of your personal social life on your professional identity formation? And what's the kind of pattern that you're seeing with this mask making exercises?
So that's a really great question, and one I really appreciate. So as I reflect on my own behaviors, my own processing, my own interpretation of the pandemic, let me continue with stories. I hope you'll get a kick out of this, but on March 5th, my son and I flew to London, and we then got on a train and went up to Liverpool, and we watched Liverpool play, I think it was Southampton, at Anfield. And it was an interesting experience because the National Health Service had posted placards, and in the stadium scoreboard, there was this thing, the coronavirus. So it was sort of percolating under the surface to a large degree. While we were there at the Liverpool match, we decided the next day we'd go to Old Trafford to see the Manchester Derby. So we scored a couple of tickets and went over to Manchester and watched Man City, Man U. And it was the same thing, the National Health Service, this undercurrent of identity. And then when things really changed for me is when the next morning we got up to come from Liverpool back to London, the train had been canceled. And so the staff had called in with concerns about coronavirus, and they weren't coming to work. And so it was a scramble to get back to London. So there was a little bit of panic, if I could use that word, that started to set in. And I didn't want my son to see that, right? Because I'm, the guy that's in charge of this trip, and everything's under control and fine. And then we get to Heathrow, and Heathrow's empty. There was nobody at Heathrow. And if you've been through Heathrow, that just never happens. And then we went to board our plane, which was a 777 coming from London back to Philly. And there were maybe 40 people on the plane. It was haunting. And I remember sitting on the tarmac. I remember sitting on the runway, and I remember thinking, please just get this plane in the air. Please get me back. So I was. And then as I reflected, it took me back to my experience in the Navy and deployment. And so whenever we would go on a deployment, you would leave you kind of knew how long you'd be gone, but sometimes not really. You were forced to sometimes prepare on a relatively short notice. Perhaps you didn't pack everything you intended to. There was uncertainty, there was anxiety, but you locked into this mentality of mission. You locked into this mentality of taking care of your ship, your shipmates, and then yourself. And so for me, the COVID first 2 months was pure deployment mentality. Is my responsibility is to our students, my responsibility is to our patients, my responsibility is to my colleagues, and this is the mission, so this is the work that needs to be done. And then, I need to take care of myself, because if I'm of no use to myself, I'm of no use to anybody else. And so I would say I've never lived through anything like COVID. I'm not sure any of us have, but having been through an analogous, if I could use that word, process through military deployments was for me personally, Swapno, very, very helpful in a methodical approach to each day to just keep getting through.
Yeah, no, that's true. Some of those life experiences are quite handy for a person like you, I guess, from your Navy experiences, because a person like me, who is quite junior in this journey of medicine, it's very difficult to kind of formulate your own plans, because you're pretty much relying on this novel experiences and you're learning as you go. And it's very difficult to navigate through those experiences. And that's why we are scrambling here to kind of get some inputs from people from overseas to what they are seeing, what they are experiencing, and then trying to make our plans based on their experiences. And I think that kind of identity formation process was kind of happening in that moment as we walking through that pandemic. And we are a bit lucky in a way that we didn't go through the same experiences as Italians have gone through or Spanish people have gone through. But I must say that I guess those who lived in that kind of experiences, and including you and people in States, will look at things a bit differently after this pandemic. And I think that will shape your professional identity years, I guess.
It sure will. And eventually what I will do is every session I make a mask with participants, because it's important to me. In so doing, I have found people feel less judged if the leader is participating. And so eventually I will sit down and create a COVID mask. That is on the list of things to do, and probably early this summer. I think we're reaching a steady state here in central Pennsylvania where there will be time and space to do that. And quite interestingly, circling back to how we, to something we talked about before we were on air, is just what's happening in the sense of American culture right now, racial tension and violence. And I need that to be part of this mask, because this is part of the experience, the lived experience of the now.
Yeah, that's right. Pretty sure your research projects and all your exercises will inform all of us as an educator that how we should approach, because a lot of time we get bogged down into this traditional pedagogies and trying to innovate a little bit here and there in those pedagogies. But I think trying something completely different, like mask making, professional identity formation, and then tying back to how students learn and how we should teach them, I think that's quite insightful, I must say. So Mark, before I let you go, what's your advice to budding educators?
I think if I could keep it simple, respect others and be true to yourself.
That's great advice. It's very short, crisp, and to the point, I must say. So Mark, thank you very much for your valuable time. And I'm pretty sure I will get you in another podcast in a few months' time with your all exciting results with this mask making exercise. So thank you.
Thank you, Swapnil. I've so much enjoyed seeing you and talking with you today. It's just been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.